We are certainly glad to be back once again, especially if you're visiting with us. We're so thankful that you're here. We mentioned the announcement just a moment ago about Philip and Amber Garcia. Mentioned that Amber was Chris and Gail Garner. I wanted to say Chris and Gail Sayer, but I knew it wasn't Gail Sayer. Chris and Gail Garner, that's their granddaughter. But also remember, Philip Garcia is David and Rachel Garcia's son. And, of course, they have recently moved to Waxahachie and are attending up there now. So we miss them, but continue to pray for them and all of their endeavors as well. He was, you might say, a crusty old man. Crusty because his hands, it seemed, always had bits of clay and dirt under the fingernails and in the creases of his knuckles. As he turned his hand over, you could feel the smoothness of his fingers. There were no fingerprints left, for he had spent years at the potter's wheel. The clay slipping through his hand, the little bits and pieces of sand in the clay, sanding away the fingertips, or the fingerprints on his fingertips. He was the kind of man who was a master at his work, and yet at the same time he welcomed those who were new to the craft, those who would be apprentices, those who would learn how to throw a proper pot, or a pitcher, or a cup, or even a saucer. And he would invite students in, and for years he always had an apprentice at his side. Maybe on another wheel who was turning out a cup very much like the cup that he was working on. And together they worked through the years, side by side, fellow laborers, co-workers. Through the years, they always had that one unique purpose. Can you imagine if your lifetime's work was not the one who was the master sitting at the potter's wheel, but the assistant who was sitting there and helping him day in and day out? Throwing a cup just like he was throwing his. Making a plate just like he was making his. So that at the end of the day you would have an entire play set to show for it. Matching pots with matching glazes and colors and decorations and engravings. Maybe he's not a potter. Maybe he's a master fence builder. And you're the one who is stretching the wire with him down the post. Or maybe he's a master home builder and you're swinging a hammer alongside him. Maybe he's a master farmer and you're checking the moisture of the wheat to see if it's ready to be harvested. You are not just learning the craft from him, but you have the opportunity to work beside the very best of the best. Do you realize that is what we are doing? Paul, in many of his letters, during the conclusion, will write about those who were working with him. For example, in the close of the book of Romans in chapter 16, he refers to Timothy, his fellow worker. At the close of the book of Philemon, he refers to my fellow workers, Aristarchus, Mark, Demas, and Luke. It's an interesting list. From Aristarchus to Luke, the great physician, Mark, the author of the second gospel, John Mark, and Demas. You remember at one time, Demas was very faithful. Demas was a fellow laborer of Paul. And for eternity, his name is etched there at the closing of the book of Philemon to remind us that at one time he was working with Paul. Justus, also known as Jesus. Urbano. All of these were referred to by Paul as my fellow laborers. My co-workers, those along whom I labor. And you can imagine Luke and Titus and Timothy, and what a great honor it would have been to work beside the Apostle Paul. That great evangelist who went from town to town proclaiming the secret gospel of the kingdom of God. That which was hidden for a time, and yet God, through Paul, revealed it unto the ages. Revealed it unto the races, unto the people, so that all may know the saving grace of God. And to stand next to him. Can you imagine week in and week out to sit at the feet of Paul and listen to his lessons? And then Paul to tell you it's time for you to get up and do your lesson. and to encourage you what it would be like to be working side by side with Paul. Oh, it gives me chills to think about. What great excitement there would be to be a fellow laborer of Paul. And yet, as great as Paul was in his evangelistic efforts, as great as he is in his reputation that transcends time and comes from the first century to here we are in the 21st century, and we still talk about the greatness of the Apostle Paul. I want you to think about, from 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 9, a statement that Paul makes that ramps that up to such a higher degree, because he says we. Uses that first person plural, we, which includes not only himself as the writer and those who are with him, but those who are reading his paper, those who are reading this letter with him. We, I want you to listen closely, are fellow workers with God. Can you imagine your name next to Paul? Paul's fellow worker. Oh, wow, that's great. That's nothing compared to. We are God's fellow workers. We work alongside God. God is the master potter at the wheel. And we are the ones who sit around Him and assist Him and work toward the same common good and the same purpose that God is seeking in this life. That's who we are if we are Christians. And we have put our hand to the plow to work with God. In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul has identified that there are some that were simply not spiritually minded. He said, I wanted to write to you about, as spiritual people, but I couldn't. You weren't ready for it. And so when I was with you, I taught you as one teaching an infant, a child. I gave you milk and not meat. I did the things which were going to benefit you and help you to grow to that mature Christian adulthood. But while I was there, you were just infants. And it wasn't just a matter of time, because he spent 18 months at least with them in Corinth, teaching and preaching and pulling them along and to the point of adulthood, and yet they're not maturing. And he says, even now I want to talk to you as spiritual people, but you still have not grown. I've been gone a while, and you're still not growing, because there is still strife and envy among you. And that strife and envy specifically that he's talking about in this context was the strife and envy and division that they held because of their relationship with God, or their relationship with the different preachers. I'm of Paul, and I am of Apollos. And he says, are you not just being human when you do that? Aren't you just being a carnal, fleshly minded person when you say, well, I follow Paul. Well, I follow Apollos. And it was causing division within the church. It was immature Christianity, we might say infantile Christianity, focused upon the human aspects as opposed to the divine and spiritual aspects. There had to be something greater. So in verse 5, Paul begins this discussion about us being co-workers with God. And he says, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? You can put the personal pronouns in. Who then is Apollos? Or who is Paul? What ranking do they have? What right does Paul or Apollos, and of course himself being Paul, what right do I have that you would say you are my follower, when all along I have been saying, follow Christ, and follow Christ? Who am I that you would change that? It's a great question. Then Paul answers it. Servants through whom you believed, according as the Lord has assigned to each. Now, that's a pretty amazing verse. Notice what he says. We are just servants. You know, a lot of times we don't like to think of ourselves more lowly than we want to think. I know what Paul writes in Romans chapter 12 is that we ought not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. That is, we ought not put ourselves too high. There is a position that we ought to think of ourselves. There are those in our world today who think of themselves to be lower than low, unworthy and invaluable to God and to anybody else, and they have a poor self-esteem, and certainly that's not what God has called us to do. He says that we ought not think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. That means there is a high position that we ought to think of ourselves as children of God, as servants of the King, as those who are beloved of the Creator, and yet we ought not think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. That higher than what we ought to be. And that's the problem that was happening in Corinth in this day. Those who were following Apollos thought themselves to be higher than those who were following Paul. And those who were following Paul were saying they were higher than those who were following Cephas. And he's trying to get them to understand that it is not that these men are something particularly great or somewhat or of high reputation. He says, who are they? They are but servants. Servants. Now notice the next word is not in whom you believed, but what? Through whom you believed. You see that? There's a great distinction between through whom and in whom. They are simply servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. We read over that phrase, we may just pass it by and think, well, God has assigned these people to Paul or these to Apollos. But you've got to understand how God and why God assigns. There is a phenomena in Christianity that each night I thank God for it. Every day I look to see it in my life and maybe look for it in your life. But there are certain people in this world that are searching for the truth. They're looking for the gospel. They recognize that their life up to this point is leaving something to be desired. That life is too hard without God. And so they're asking, God, what can I do? God, where do I need to go? God, who do I need to talk to? God, I want something better in my life than what I have. I cannot go on my own. These are the few sinners who are desperately seeking salvation. And the promise is that when a sinner is searching, God will put a Christian in their way. It's happened throughout the New Testament. You think of Acts chapter 8. The Ethiopian eunuch, he wants desperately to know God. He wants to come to a knowledge of His truth, to be saved by His grace. He is just leaving an entire religious service of the Jewish worship service behind, going home, and he's reading the Scriptures so that he may more intimately know this God. And God takes Philip and puts him in his way. Do you understand what you read? How can I, except someone would teach me? And he joins himself to the chariot, and he begins in the passage of Isaiah 53, and he continues preaching unto him Jesus Christ, and the eunuch eventually comes to a knowledge of the truth. Acts chapter 8. God brought the sinner and the saint together so that the saint could teach him the gospel. In Acts chapter 9, Paul is on the road to Damascus. He is struck blind. And he asks the Lord, what must I do? And He says, go into the city and on the street called Straight, and there will be told what you will do. And then God appears to Ananias and He says, I've got someone for you. I've got the Pharisee Paul, straight up from Jerusalem, ready to kill Christians. That's who I've got for you. You need to go teach him. And Ananias, there's a little bit of fear and trepidation, but at the urging of God, he goes. And Paul obeys the gospel and is saved by the grace of God. Where a sinner who is searching to know God, there is going to be a saint that God brings them into their path. In Acts chapter 10, Cornelius is giving alms to the poor. He's teaching his family. He's leading people in a devout way that they look toward God, and yet he's not saved. And he says, send to Joppa and get Peter, who is staying with Simon the tanner, and bring him. And Peter came, and he told him words whereby he must be saved. There was a sinner who was searching, and there was a saint who was able, and God put the saint in the sinner's way. You see what happened? He said, what are Apollos and Paul? They're just servants through whom you believed. As the Lord assigned to each one, as the Lord put them in your path. so that you might know, God is still putting us, Christians, in the paths of sinners. There are still people today, believe it or not, who are searching for something greater than what they currently have. Something higher than they are now. Something better than what they endure. Life is a living hell to them now. And they recognize there's something better, something easier, something greater at the end. And I simply will not go this way any longer. They are a sinner searching for the truth. And what I know is that God picks me, and He picks you, and you, and you, and everyone in this auditorium who are Christians, and He will put us in their way. And we do what God has called us to do. What's amazing is in this next verse, in clarification, he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And we see the first aspect of how we are fellow workers with God. We are fellow workers with God even though we have a diversity of ministries. What each one of us is able to do based upon our skills and based upon our abilities, God expects us only to do what we can do. There's the song that says, if just a cup of water I place within your hand, then just a cup of water is all that I demand. God does not expect us or ask us to go beyond what we are capable of doing. But God takes some of us who might be great cooks and puts us in the way of the sinner who is searching, who might need a meal. He takes some of us who might be great servants or great builders and puts us in the way of the searching sinner who needs something built. God takes those of us who may be good communicators or good preachers and puts us in the way of those sinners who are searching, who are ready to listen and whose hearts are opened. God will assign to each of us tasks, just as He assigned to Apollos and Paul. And what they did was took that gospel and through their message shared it with those around them. And He does it today. And you may say, yes, but I can't cook and I can't preach. But you can teach. Maybe you can't teach. There are multitude, many, hundreds, possibly even thousands of tasks that need to be done. And God calls upon each one of us to perform what we can do to reach out to those who are lost. There is a world that is searching. I know we look at the world and we say, yes, but no one's really searching today. And that may be true. It may very well be the case that there's not as many people whose hearts are open unto the gospel. The devil is doing a great job. We know that. The devil is doing a great job to blind people's eyes and to close their hearts off. And yet there is still the power of God in His Word. It is the same power that existed in the first century and the second century, and it exists today in the 21st century. And it just takes us sitting at the wheel next to God and sharing that message of salvation. We have a diversity of ministry. Paul says, I planted. That was one aspect of the metaphor. The metaphor was that of farming, of putting grain crops out. And he says, I planted. That was my job. That was my duty. I've done that. That's as God has assigned to me. That's what I did. And Apollos watered. That was his duty. That's what was assigned to him. And he accomplished his duty. And by me and Apollos working and doing what we were supposed to do, God gave the increase. In whose way did God put you? This is the question we've got to be asking ourselves. You know what your skills are, your abilities. How is God trying to use you as His fellow worker? As God's fellow worker, we each have a ministry, but that ministry is important. Later in 1 Corinthians 12, he will talk about the one who says, the body is not one member, but the body is many members. One body and many members. And the foot cannot say, because I am not the hand, I will not work. We need the hand and the foot. Because I am not the eye, I'm not important. No, each one of us is important. There is no task so small that is not needed. And in the context, he's saying there's no task that is so great that it's glorious, or that it receives glory. In other words, God receives all of the glory. There's not one thing that any of us can do as an individual and say, see, I have mastered it. I have brought the church to where it is. I deserve the praise. I deserve the glory. I deserve the following. No. That never happens. Not in God's kingdom. It happens in man's kingdom. And it happens when men corrupt the church. But it doesn't happen in God's church. There's a diversity of ministries. But what's amazing about this diversity of ministries is that it involves a humility of our spirits. In order to work alongside God. In the corporate world, you may work alongside a person for a while and then a promotion comes up. And now you're both fighting over that promotion. Who's going to get that promotion and be over the other one. And we all want to, we want to get to that point. With God, there's never a point at which we become equal with God and His ability. He will always be the master, the teacher, the Lord. And we will always be beneath Him. So he says in verse 7, he says, so neither the one that plants nor the one that waters is anything, but only God who gives the increase. Notice the humility there. Neither the one that plants nor the one who waters. These were two important, imperative, essential duties in order to save people in the church at Corinth. There were those in Corinth who had been baptized by Paul. There were those in Corinth who had been baptized by Apollos. They had been taught the gospel. They had sat at the feet of Paul for a year and a half. They knew him. And yet Paul says, in all of that, we are nothing. Neither he that plants nor he that waters is anything. There is no reputation. There is no glory to be had. Because all of the growth came from God. God empowers our work. Never think, well, if God is giving the increase, then I guess I don't have to do anything. God will always give the increase. Because someone has planted the seed, which is the Word of God, and someone has tended it with water and weeding. And brethren, if we're not the ones who are planting and we're not the ones who are watering, then we're the ones who are not working with God. Now, that water and weeding, obviously, are metaphors for different parts of the work, and we all have different parts to play. But even when we play those parts to the best of our ability, and we see great success from them, we are at no point saying, well, look at that. I didn't know I was that good. It must have been my amazing methods of evangelism. My persuasive speech, my wonderful smile, my good looks, my caring touch, my generous hands. No. Success comes because of my God. And yes, God will bring success through my generous hands and my servant's heart and whatever it may be that God utilizes to reach out to others. But we must always remember that our work is enabled by God, empowered by the Creator. And so we are humbled. We humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord that He may ultimately exalt us into heaven. Let he that thinks he stands take heed lest he falls. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12. God gives grace unto the humble. Let us see that our work, while important, does not replace the work of God. There is a humility of spirit to be God's co-worker. To always play second fiddle to the King of the universe. And then finally, look at verses 8 and 9. He keeps up the metaphor of the water and the planting. He says, "He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wage according to his labor." He who plants and he who waters are one. That is, even though their duties were diverse, even though the works which they did were different, they were all for one general purpose of building up the field. In fact, I think you can look at these, and even though he mentions specifically he that waters and he that plants, there's a third here, that is God. God is in with us, and all of us have a unity, we might say, of purpose. We want to see the church grow. We want to see souls saved. That's what it means to be a worker of God. A worker of God, or worker with God, a co-worker with God, is not just one who recognizes the diversity of ministry and the humility of His Spirit, but also recognizes the unity of purpose that God has set the agenda. Our agenda is the salvation of souls. He sent His Son to this earth and sacrificed Him for the salvation of souls. Are we to think that God's work today is any different than what it cost Him with the blood of His Son, the salvation of souls? And we will receive our rewards according to the works which we have done. We understand that. He's been telling us that since the beginning of Christ's ministry. Matthew 16 and verse 27. He says that He is going to come and He's going to render unto every man according to his works. Every one of us will be rewarded based upon how we have responded toward God. But then He says that in verse 9. And every time I read it, I smile. For we are God's fellow workers. God is not a snobby master who sits above the apprentices, deigns to look upon their work to see if it's anywhere close to His. But rather, God is the master who wraps His hands around ours that we may feel the work, that we may know intimately how He wants it done. To train us. Not that He wants us to stop, but to train us in a way that we complement one another and His work. It says we are His fellow workers. You are His field. In other words, if God is the farmer and He's the one that's giving the increase, you as Christians are His field. God is growing Christians. He's planting the seed of God that He can grow Christians. And then He finishes verse 9. He says, you are His building. He's growing Christians to build the church. And right beside Him, I stand. You stand. Right beside Him stands every Christian as a co-laborer, as one who is working with God for the same common purpose. And He takes our small and medium and large efforts, and He empowers every one of them so that they can be successful. But in order to be a co-worker with God, you know what you've got to do? You've got to work. You've got to find what it is that you bring to the table and do it. God has put you in the way of a sinner. I know He has. Because there's a lot of sinners out there. And He needs everyone on deck. All hands on deck so that He can save as many as possible. He has used you to put you in the way of a sinner. Will you put your hand to that plow? Will you work that soil? Will you be what God wants you to be? You know, some people aren't workers because they're not part of the team yet. We can change that. Today you can be part of the team, obeying the gospel, being baptized for the remission of your sins. God will add you to His church. God will empower your deeds, no matter how big or small they might be. He can work through you. And other people are not working with God because they choose not to. Maybe it's the part of the infantile Christian that Paul talks about in the first part of chapter 3. The point is, Paul didn't want to keep them as infants. It was unnatural for them to still be infants. And it's unnatural for you to still be a child. Today it's time to grow up. It's time to come to the fold with a heart and hands willing to work. Are you ready to be God's fellow worker today? If you're ready to make a change in your life, and that's what it's going to take, a change by decision, we're going to ask you to come while we stand this